Hi guys, I am coming to you with video number 2 for anatomy in my husband's man cave, his gaming setup here. I'm very fortunate that he was able to kind of set this up, so hopefully that you guys can see me, as well as the slides that we're going to discuss for Module 11, the cardiovascular system. So we're going to tackle just the first roughly 12 slides of this material today, and then at the end of this video I'm going to go over just a couple of housekeeping things for you guys to be keeping track of as we move ahead in this module. This is my first time recording in this setup, so bear with me. There seems to be a little bit of technical difficulties. I created these PowerPoints in Keynote on an Apple, and my husband's operating system is a PC. So there's some issues with the transitions when I switched over from Apple to PC. So the slides may not run as smooth as they usually do in class, but good enough that you can still get the material and as we discuss. So follow along. You guys have already made a outline, or you should have submitted an outline for this module. So you are familiar with the major concepts, but follow along, maybe either add to your current outline that you made, or if you'd like, you can shoot me an email and I'm happy to send over this entire PowerPoint for you as well for your reference. Again, we have no clue what's going to happen here in the next month or two, whether or not we'll be back at school or not. In the event that we are, then we will have a final exam as we've discussed, and this material will be on that. So you are responsible for this material, even though the way we're going about it right now is a little unconventional. I still want you to learn this, and especially if you're going to be taking Anatomy 2 next year, understanding blood and the cardiovascular system and how your heart works is a crucial part of how God created us. And so we're going to get started. So like I said, this is Module 11, the cardiovascular system. And the first thing we're going to be talking about are the basic functions of blood. You guys, to some extent, are probably familiar with blood. You've seen your own blood. You've probably had blood drawn. And you have probably some general ideas of some of the things that blood does or contains. But we're going to dive a little bit deeper into that today. And so there are kind of three overarching main functions of blood, and you will be responsible for knowing what these three kind of overarching functions of blood are, and so we're going to go over each one individually. So the first is that blood functions as a transport medium, and this is kind of probably what most people think of when you think of blood. You think of the fact that blood is moving or transporting things throughout your entire body. And so as a transport medium, blood picks up oxygen from the lungs and it delivers it to the tissues of your body. We breathe in the oxygen in the air, and then that is transported in the blood to provide the oxygen that all of our cells need. Additionally, it also picks up carbon dioxide and waste product from those tissues and delivers those back to the lungs for us to exhale that waste product and carbon dioxide. So that's probably not a super new concept to you guys, and that's kind of what most people focus on when they think about blood. The second kind of overarching function of blood is that blood is a regulatory tissue. And it's involved in the regulation of a couple things. The first is it's involved in the regulation of your fluid volume maintenance. And what we mean by that is that it helps to deliver fluid to different areas of the body. And so different areas have different fluid requirements, and so blood can function as a tissue to kind of control that. Additionally, as a regulatory tissue, it equalizes temperature differences in your body. We are able to warm our body with blood, and we know that it's important to maintain homeostasis in our bodies around that ideal temperature set point. And so while there are other factors that contribute to this, as we've discussed in the previous unit, hormones in the endocrine system play a role in equalizing body temperature. But your blood also plays a really significant role in keeping that body temp where it should be. And the last thing that it regulates is your pH level. You guys know that pH comes on a scale of 1 to 14, with the lower half, 1 through 7, being acidic, and the 7 through 14 being basic. It should not surprise you that our blood needs to be maintained around a pretty tight pH balance. Again, that's just another example of homeostasis in the body that needs to be maintained. And the third basic overarching function of blood is as a protective tissue. And so what we mean by that is a protective tissue as in it protects against excess blood or fluid loss, like when you get a cut. It's never a good thing if you get a cut and it continues to bleed and bleed and bleed and you can't get the bleeding to stop. That probably is an indication that you either have a really, really severe wound that requires medical care, or you may have an issue with some of the components of your blood that we're going to talk about that should be in place to help you stop bleeding, to clot your cut and save the blood loss. And so it protects against fluid loss, and it also protects against infection. You guys have probably at some point heard of white blood cells before. And those are the infection-fighting agents basically in our blood. And so this is a really important function of blood, because blood infections or infections of any kind are not okay. They're a very serious matter. And so God has put into place some really intricate and marvelously designed mechanisms to protect us. Okay? And it wouldn't be a slideshow without some corny jokes, and I'm bored, so I found this meme. It says, 2 blood cells met and fell in love, but alas, it was all in vain. Okay, so some science humor to break up the monotony here of the cardiovascular system. All right, so talking now about the specific composition of blood. You've probably heard the phrase, blood is thicker than water. That's a common phrase that people use to talk about the relationship with their families and such. And that's because blood is a viscous liquid. And so it's about 3 times more viscous than water is. And you'll have to excuse the fact that my animations are just popping up on command right now. I'm hoping it's going to stop before it switches to the next slide. But when we talk about blood as being viscous, we're talking about the viscosity or the resistance to flow, and an alteration of the shape due to cohesion. And so blood, you guys have poured water out of a glass before. You've also probably had a cut that was dripping blood. So you've seen that blood is definitely thicker than water. And it's the red blood cells, which are commonly abbreviated RBCs, that give blood this property. The red blood cells have a stickiness to them or a slight cohesion, which is what gives that thickness to your blood. Blood is also more dense than water because the iron that we have in our red blood cells contribute to this density. And so we're going to talk more about iron shortly, but it's an important component of your blood, and you guys have probably heard of diseases like anemia and stuff, which we're going to touch upon, which are basically issues with the amount of iron that you have in your blood. Additionally, as we said, the blood pH must be tightly controlled, maintaining that homeostasis in our bodies. And so the ideal set point for blood is 7.35 to 7.45. Anything outside of that is very dangerous to the human body, and tissues and organs do not function properly if you fall out of that range. And so that's something occasionally doctors will be monitoring if you have some kind of unusual blood condition. And the bodily chemicals or the chemical reactions that occur in your body, we know that there's hundreds of different chemical reactions that occur at the cellular level and tissue level. They require that specific pH, which is why it's important. And so your body was designed by God to contain a really intricate and elegant buffering system that helps to maintain that control. And we'll talk about that again in a further slide. Continuing our discussion on blood composition, blood has a volume of about 5 to 6 liters in the human body, for an adult that is, and it's roughly 8% of your adult body weight. So it's a pretty good chunk. If you shaved off whatever, if you got on the scale today and shaved off 8% of whatever that scale said, that's roughly the amount of blood you've got sitting in your body right now. So a pretty substantial amount when you think about it, given that it is a liquid. And our blood can be separated into two basic parts. You've probably heard of some of them. The first is the plasma part, which is the fluid portion of blood. And it's made up of mostly water. There are other things in the plasma, and this is roughly 55% by volume of your blood. So of the 8% of your adult body weight, your blood is 55% by volume plasma, and again, that's predominantly water. The second main part we can separate our blood into is called just the formed elements of blood, and these are those things that you've probably heard of in your blood before. These are the red blood cells, the RBCs, the white blood cells, abbreviated WBCs oftenly, and cell fragments, which you may have heard of, called platelets. And this makes up roughly 45% by volume of your blood composition. And so if we go to the next slide, there's a photo from your book that kind of breaks this down. So you guys can see here, we've got the formed elements making up 45%, okay? And of those, that's going to be your red and white blood cells and platelets. And then we've got your plasma, which is about 90% water, and also includes things like ions, nutrients, waste, gases, and regulatory chemicals. And some major proteins, which we're going to be discussing at a later point, including albumin, globulins, and fibrinogen. Okay? All right, and so if we're going to focus here for right now on the plasma of your blood. So that first major section of your blood composition. Plasma is a pale yellow liquid that's made up of roughly, like we said, 90% water. The rest is those proteins, gases, nutrients, ions, and waste product that are carried and transported in your blood. Okay, and there are 3 main types of protein that we talk about. We said proteins right here. There's 3 main types. The first is going to be albumin. You may have heard of this before, or if you've ever paid any attention to your blood work, then maybe you've seen this on a medical chart before. But albumin is a small protein. It makes up nearly half of the proteins in your plasma, and it is made or synthesized by your liver. It is involved in regulating movement of water between your tissues and your blood through osmosis. So again, it's maintaining kind of a water balance between your blood and the tissues that the blood is delivering nutrients to. The second major of the 3 proteins that we find in plasma are the globulins. Okay, and these make up roughly 1/3 of the proteins that you find in your plasma. And some of these act as carriers or carrier proteins. We've talked about those in the past. While others, which we call gamma globulins, will fight off infection. So this kind of has a 2-part function here, by not only functioning as a carrier protein for certain molecules, but also in infection fighting. And the last, as you can see, is the protein fibrinogen. And this is an inactive protein that we find in our blood, and it's going to be playing a critical role in injury and blood clotting. And we're going to focus on this a lot more in a previous slide, because blood clotting is not a simple task. It's very intricate and quite confusing at times, honestly. And so just keep it in the back of your mind that fibrinogen is already present in your plasma, and it is in its inactive form, but will later become active during the process of blood clotting. All right. So something to note before we move on is that we lose water through our kidneys and as urine, and we lose water vapor in our lungs when we breathe, and we also lose some water in our perspiration if we're sweating. And so these are always that we, excrete water in our body, and we also take in water through food and drink, right? And so there's always this kind of influx of water coming in and out. But despite this, even though the fact that plasma is 90% water, the level of plasma within our blood stays really constant. And so there are so many mechanisms in here in place that keep that constant despite our water intake or our water excretion levels. Okay. So now jumping from the first section of blood composition, the plasma, to the formed elements of blood, we're going to talk about what is composed in that. So the formed elements, if we start with the red blood cells, or the RBCs, they're actually technically called erythrocytes. That's the official scientific name for a red blood cell. So please make sure that you understand that an erythrocyte is the same thing as an RBC or a red blood cell. And so the erythrocytes are the red blood cells that carry the oxygen in the blood. And when most of us think of a blood cell or blood, because I know you guys think about that all the time in your spare time, you're probably thinking of an erythrocyte, the typical kind of red blob, if you will. Maybe you've studied it in a previous science class or a health class. This is what we're talking about here. And the erythrocytes make up roughly 95% of your formed elements. And they're a disc shape, but they have a concave or flattened center. And again, you've probably seen an image like this before. There was, in the background of that corny meme there, were pictures of erythrocytes. And so they carry oxygen between the cells of your lungs when you breathe in and to the cells or the tissues throughout the rest of your body. And now oxygen is nonpolar, and we studied earlier this year, it feels like ages ago, but we studied polarity a little bit in nonpolar and polar substances. And so we know that because oxygen is nonpolar, that it doesn't mix with water in the blood. And so because of this, the oxygen needs a vehicle. It needs a transport mechanism to get it from place to place in our body. And so that mechanism, that transport vehicle, is the protein hemoglobin. Again, you've probably heard of this in passing maybe, but hemoglobin is a really iron-rich protein complex. And we're going to take a look at a picture on a further slide here of what that looks like. But it's a complex protein structure that carries this oxygen. All right, and so that's all the red blood cells, but then we also have the white blood cells, and those are called leukocytes, okay? So that's the scientific name. Again, make sure that you understand that white blood cells are the same as leukocytes. And leukocytes are the white blood cells that perform the defensive functions in blood, and they're for immune system support and infection fighting. And so we already touched upon that, but these are really important. And if you are fighting some type of infection in your body, or you're hospitalized, one of the first things that doctors do is they're going to draw blood and kind of see where you're at, but they're going to be looking to see, are your white blood cells or your leukocytes elevated? Because if they're elevated, that's telling them that you're fighting some type of infection in your body, because your body has sent out these leukocytes to fight a war against a pathogen or whatever is going on in your system. So a lot of times they're closely monitored during cancer treatment for patients, because there can be a lot of fluctuations between their white blood cell counts when they're fighting cancer. The third component of the formed elements in your blood are called thrombocytes. And these are just fragments of cells that we have in the blood that help prevent blood loss when we get a cut or some type of injury. And so these fragments of white blood cells, we also call them megakaryocytes, and they're found in bone marrow. Okay, so the thrombocytes are basically a fragment of the white blood cells, and their main priority is to prevent blood loss in the body. All right. So, to kind of check up on what we've covered so far, I'm going to go over a couple of the fact questions from your book. All right, so number 1, if it wants to click, says, what are the basic functions of blood? So those are those 3 basic functions we talked about on the very first slide there. That's that blood functions as a transportation medium, as a regulatory tissue, and as a protective tissue. Again, you're responsible for knowing what those basic functions of blood are. Number 2 says, what percentage of blood is composed of water? Okay, so the percentage of blood that's composed of water is 50%. You're going to take 55% of the plasma in blood, and if you times that by the 90% of water that's in plasma, you get that blood is composed of roughly 50% water. If you did not follow that, your on your own questions in your textbook have the answers to these in the back with a better explanation. Number 3, if the percentage of red blood cells in the blood goes up above the usual 45%, what would happen to the viscosity of blood and why? Well, we said that the red blood cells are what are responsible for giving that sticky cohesion to our blood, which is responsible for that viscosity. So if they went up above their usual 45%, you would expect the blood viscosity to be increased. Meaning it would be very thick, and that could be very dangerous and lead to clots and blockages in your arteries and veins. So that would be a very bad thing. Number 4 says, if the percentage of red blood cells in the blood were to go down to 35%, still sufficient to sustain life, that's important, do you think it would be harder or easier for the heart to pump blood, and why? So the answer is actually that it would be easier for the heart to pump the blood with a less viscous blood because it wouldn't be as thick and wouldn't require as much pumping mechanism to move it throughout your body. Again, they're saying 35% is sufficient to sustain life. That's important. Anything below that level would be deadly. And lastly, number 5, it says one type of blood test is a white blood cell count. And we touched upon this already. If your white blood cell count is high, what might that indicate? Well, as I said, that would indicate some type of infection or inflammation in the body. So those are closely monitored to make sure that your white blood cells are where they should be, so that we know that they're present in your body and they're doing their job, but that they're not out on this mission to try to reduce inflammation or infection. All right, continuing on with our discussion here on the formed elements of blood. We are going to focus a little bit more in depth on those erythrocytes, or those red blood cells here. All right, so the erythrocytes, as we said, they're a biconcave discs, so they look like, almost like, the best example I can give you is like a gummy lifesaver, except that rather than there being a full complete hole in the middle, it would just be like concave. It would be a little kind of cup in the middle there. And so because of the shape, the edge of the red blood cells are thicker than in the center. In fact, the average diameter is roughly 7.5 micrometers, so very small. Again, these are microscopic. We will only be able to view these through our microscope. And Lord willing, if we get back to school at some point, I do have blood smear slides for us to study more in depth. Okay, and so the shape of these biconcave discs, these erythrocytes, allow them to bend and deform around its thin center. So they can kind of twist and move around, and that's important because your body has some twists and turns in it, right? It's not a straight highway, of blood vessels. Like, they're branching out throughout different organs and tissues in your body, and so they're likely to encounter twists and turns and maybe some more narrow or wide vessels along the way. So this is important. And the mature red blood cells, they don't have a nucleus, so they're anucleated, and that's important, but it creates a really limited metabolism for these red blood cells. And because they don't have a nucleus, and we know that DNA is located in the nucleus, there's a lack of DNA, and therefore there's a lack of cellular machinery. And so by cellular machinery, we mean organelles. So honestly, these are pretty, I don't want to say they're simple cells, because there's nothing simple about the human body, as we've learned this year. But in comparison to some more specialized cells, this has a lot less going on in it. There's no DNA, there's no nucleus, and there's not as many organelles floating around in there. But it still has to carry the oxygen throughout our body. However, it doesn't use that oxygen for itself. Well, we know that most cells in the body are using oxygen. The red blood cells do not use the oxygen that they carry. They, however, do generate a small amount of energy for their own personal use in the form of ATP via glycolysis. And if you think back to when we've touched upon this as a review this year, and think way back into your biology course where we studied cellular respiration, then you remember that glycolysis is that first step in cellular respiration, and it doesn't require oxygen. So that works out to these cells' benefits because they're not using the oxygen that they're carrying. So they need to generate energy in the absence of oxygen. And because of the simplicity of their design and the lack of cellular machinery and such, red blood cells cannot repair themselves. We know that many cells in our body can repair themselves and in different ways, but red blood cells do not. And so they only have a lifespan of approximately 4 months, or roughly 110 days. But you know from our skeletal system that we're always producing new blood cells, and that happens in the bone marrow. So even though we are constantly losing red blood cells, we're also constantly making or synthesizing red blood cells in that red bone marrow within our bloods, within our bones, sorry. And so you're actually making roughly 2 million blood cells per second. So as we sit here, we are just making millions and millions and millions of blood cells. But at the same time, roughly 2 million are also dying at the same time. And so this is just a constant cycle. Going forward. All right, and so we talked about the fact that oxygen is carried on the red blood cells, and because oxygen is nonpolar, it cannot just float in the blood as is because it doesn't mix, right? So we said we needed hemoglobin, that protein that acts as the transport vehicle for the oxygen. Okay, and so hemoglobin is what gives red blood cells their characteristic red color. And it responds exactly to the needs of the cells, either by dropping off oxygen that's needed or by picking up carbon dioxide waste that needs to be excreted from the body through the lungs. And the composition of hemoglobin is composed of 4 protein chains. Okay, so remember, amino acids are the building blocks of protein. So we're talking about long strands of amino acids here, and these 4 chains are called globins. And they fold into one of 4 particular shapes, as we'll see on the next and final slide for this lesson. Okay, and so they fold up into what we call tertiary and quaternary structures. They're very complex, twisted structures of the protein. And the middle of each of these globins holds a flat molecule that we call heme. And it makes sense, hemoglobin. These two are obviously related. And heme is an iron, heme contains an iron molecule. Iron is Fe on the periodic table. And so each one of these iron molecules is bound to a heme. And so the iron atoms that are on each heme can each bind to 1 oxygen molecule. And so therefore, there are 4 oxygen molecules that can bind to each hemoglobin. Okay, so 4 oxygen molecules will bind the iron in a hemoglobin molecule. And so when all 4 hemes, okay, because remember there's 1 for each globin, all 4 hemes are loaded with oxygen, that hemoglobin molecule is going to be bright red. And when it's full, the hemoglobin will drop off that oxygen in the tissues where it's required, and then the blood actually gets a darker color because we've delivered the iron and the oxygen where it needs to go. And so there's always an abundance of hemoglobin in each red blood cell, or at least it should be that way. Again, certain disorders like anemia, which we'll talk about in our next video, result in not enough hemoglobin or iron and different diseases that can come about when this doesn't work right. But ideally, in a healthy body, there's an abundance of hemoglobin in each red blood cell. And it's, in fact, that each red blood cell is about 1/3 hemoglobin by weight. So a big, a good chunk of the entire molecule is hemoglobin. And so this is the last slide we're going to cover today. This is just showing you the structure of hemoglobin. As you can see, it's kind of this twisty, bundled mess. It kind of reminds me of, if you've ever seen one of those like fidgety type toys that you can get at like Five Below or the Dollar Tree. They just like little trinkets that you move around and try to untangle. That's kind of what it looks like. So you're looking here, you're seeing the different globins. So we've got a beta globin here and another beta globin here, and then we've got an alpha globin and another alpha globin here, and they've color-coded them blue and yellow for you to see. Okay, and then you can see here they're showing you these the square discs here. Those are the heme molecules with the iron atom. That silver ball is attached. And so there are many of these hemoglobin molecules. About 1/3 of these make up a red blood cell in your body, carrying that water with us. All right, so that's where we're stopping today for notes and lessons, but a couple housekeeping things. I will be periodically posting some links. I have sent you these. Most of these, I think, are available on ClassReach right now, but for just some organization and simplicity's sake, I'm going to post some suggested video links below this video. So click the information below the YouTube thing, and there'll be some info there for you. The other thing that I want to say was just a reminder that your quick 2-3 minute videos for whatever disease you picked of the endocrine system using prednisone. Those videos are due Friday. So today should be Wednesday if this gets posted when it should. And so those are due Friday. Okay. So again, please don't wait till the last minute. Send those over to me. However way, works out. I'm going to be compiling your videos into like one. There's only 7 of you, so it'll just be 7 2 or 3 minute clips. And I'm going to be having you guys watch your classmates' videos, and then I'm going to be posting a discussion on ClassReach. And so stay tuned for more info on that. That'll be sometime in next week, but we are going to be having a discussion about the different diseases that you guys researched. Secondly, we usually would do a vocab quiz for each module. There's really no easy way to regulate this and do this over remote teaching. So what I did with my middle school classes in the past 2 weeks is something that I'm going to do with you. So I'm going to be sending you a link to join my Quizlet classroom. Okay, so most of you I think are familiar with how Quizlet works. Log on or create an account if you don't already have one, but log on to Quizlet and you follow my link to join my A&P 1 class. Okay, and I'll be able to see who's in that class. Shoot me an email or a ClassReach message if your username is not obvious. So if it's like Fluffy the Dog 100, shoot me an email and be like, hey, I'm Fluffy the Dog 100, because otherwise I don't know. But if it has your last name or your first name or whatever, then I'll be able to figure out who you are. And what I'm going to have you do is there's a set, another teacher made a Quizlet set that matches our curriculum for this module. And so I have added that to my class set. Study from there. I want you to study those words as you would a normal quiz. And next Wednesday, which I believe is April 15th, what you're going to do is you're going to go on, and there's a test function on Quizlet. And so this is supposed to be a practice test, but we're going to actually use it as your vocab quiz substitute. And so I will send further instructions on exactly how to set that up. But basically next Wednesday, I would like you to log on and take that test one time. And I can see how many tries you've done, and it will tell me what your grade was. And I will count that as a quiz. And so, yes, technically, obviously, you could cheat. I really hope that you'll be honest and you won't. Study as if you were going to take this in our classroom, and then just be honest and go on and go through the test real quick. And I'll put your score in. I did this with middle school, and I think most of them were honestly, they were honest, because I didn't get a bunch of 100s. I got varying grades, so I think they were honest, and they actually took the quiz as they would have. So that is what we're going to do. Again, stay tuned. I'll throw some more info on that in an email, including the class link, so you can find my classroom on Quizlet. All right, and with that, that is all I have for you today. So stay tuned for the next lesson coming up on Friday. All right, I hope you guys have a great day. Bye.